I run a foundation. I'm part of the National School Choice Movement. I run a foundation since then. That's where this going. We need to get together. You've been doing anything with Cincinnati Classic?
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Robert Alt, and I am the president and CEO of the Buckeye Institute, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this event this morning. You know, as I've thought about it, if there's anything that the school choice movement enjoys more than ensuring all students have a good education, it's arguing passionately and often counterproductively amongst itself about the best methods to do so. As a result, there are often divisions and factions in the broader school choice movement that harm the cause and set progress back. Yet here in the Buckeye State, we have defied the odds and that narrative and formed a powerful alliance that has yielded significant results. The unrivaled partnership between the Thomas Fordham Institute, School Choice Ohio, and the Buckeye Institute has avoided the usual infighting and actually advanced the ball. I would like to specifically mention the incredible working relationship between the trifecta of Yitz Frank, Chad Aldis, and Greg Lawson, who have formed an allied coalition that sets an example for the entire nation. Together with several other national groups, a sympathetic state legislature, and one of the most school-friendly legislative leadership teams in the country, we just passed the most school-friendly, parent-empowering budget in Ohio's history. And we have finally, yes, finally, assured universal school choice for every student in Ohio. Importantly, Ohio is now more in line with how other modern Western nations fund education by opening the door to a more pluralistic system that prioritizes choice and quality. Few are better positioned to talk about what that pluralism looks like globally than Dr. Ashley Berner. And do we have a treat for you all this morning? Ashley Berner is the director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and Associate Professor of Education. She published the excellent book, Pluralism and American Public Education, No One Way to School, which you can see right there, and is available on Amazon in 2017. And we have another highly anticipated book from her coming soon as Harvard Education Press will publish Education, Pluralism, and American Democracy, Exposure versus Indoctrination, in early 2024. Dr. Berner has published countless other articles, book chapters, and op-eds on citizen formation, academic outcomes, pluralism, and the political theories of education in different contexts. Her own teaching experience took place in Jewish preschool, an Episcopal secondary school, and an open university in Louisiana. She also currently advises doctoral students at Johns Hopkins University. I also have the honor of introducing our esteemed friend and our moderator for this morning, Checker Finn, who is a distinguished fellow and president emeritus of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Mr. Finn's background is indisputably impressive. He served as Fordham's president from 1997 to 2014 and was previously a professor of education and public policy at Vanderbilt University, as well as Assistant Secretary for Research and Improvement and Counselor to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. Earlier positions he held include Staff Assistant to the President of the United States, Special Assistant to the Governor of Massachusetts, Counsel to the U.S. Ambassador to India, Research Associate at the Brookings Institution, and Legislative Director for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. We've just scratched the surface of our speaker's impressive accomplishments, but with that brief professional context, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Ashley Berner and Checker Finn.
I just wanted to add Fordham's congratulations to Ohio for its extraordinary recent gains in the school choice world. We are thrilled to have been part of it, and we are thrilled to co-sponsor this opportunity to talk about how Ohio might go even farther. and join a worldwide idea that education as a fundamentally pluralist activity rather than a state activity from which there are exceptions made. It's a very different way to view the scene, and nobody knows more about it than Ashley. So I'm not going to steal any of her time. I'll ask her a few questions later. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I just want to thank the hosts for inviting me and bringing me. It's a real joy to be here. My grandfather was born and raised in Ohio, and so it's lovely to be back. I am hopeful that I am technologically capable enough of advancing this, but let me just start with a question, which is, what is public education? Now, if you ask anybody in the United States, people of my age and older, for sure, public education is the neighborhood school, right? Much to my surprise, when I studied abroad, lived abroad, and started looking at education around the world, much to my surprise, most countries don't think of public education as one thing. And that's what we're going to unpack today. If you were in the Netherlands, public education would be state funding for 36 different kinds of schools and academic accountability on the back end. We're going to unpack that a little bit. If you were in the UK, where I did my graduate work, and you could put your child in a Jewish day school, a Montessori school, the state still delivers public education. This is a partnership orientation. It's very, very different. So what I want to do in this talk is pull back from the American context and say the binary public versus private versus charter world is anomalous. And there are real downsides to having this kind of animus. And there's a real positive side on the other end if we can get there. So feel free to flag me down, but I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can so we can have a conversation. But we're going to start with theory and then move down into practice. So what is educational pluralism? What does it mean? How is it justified? How is it different from what we have? And what would it look like in practice? So, oopsie, that was too fast. Help. Wait, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so educational pluralism is simply a different way to structure public education in which the government funds and regulates, but doesn't necessarily operate all of the schools. It is, if you will, has parent options by design and also academic accountability by design. Most democracies are pluralistic. In fact, UNESCO recently surveyed 204 nations with which they work on education. Out of 204 nations, 171 have some kind of public-private partnership or are historically plural. So let me just give you an example of this. In the Netherlands, as I said, 36 different kinds of schools are funded equally. 30% of the students still attend what we would consider a district school. Those schools are important. And instead of focusing on school sector competition, which kind of school is better, their Ministry of Education helps all schools get better. And actually, the Netherlands and the UK are known for being some of the more effective at that kind of external evaluation and so forth. When the English Parliament voted for the first time in 1834 to create national education, they channeled the funds through the voluntary sector, through the Church of England, the Catholic Church, the Jewish communities. In 1870, they created what we would call district schools, board schools. So there's a kind of real mix there. Australia's federal government is the #1 funder of private schools in the country because of those schools' proven capacity to build citizenship skills and academic opportunity. Educational uniformity is what the United States' default has been for 100 years. Many of our state constitutions actually have the term uniform school system, as you know. The famous Blaine amendments assume that the state is the deliverer of education exclusively, and we're also not alone in this. Bolivia and China and other countries as well are educationally uniform. Greece, interestingly, has a uniform school system, but it's Greek Orthodox. So there's all kinds of variety in there. So that's the kind of big picture. Now there's a history about this. Many of you know this history. The United States opened the 19th century with a pluralistic structure. We used to fund a variety of schools that reflected the local demography. Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, Horace Mann's common school movement was not taken up wildly because it was seen as diminishing the difference between different belief systems and so forth. It was not until the middle of the 19th century that the Catholic immigrants came in such numbers that in places like Boston, they were 50% of the school population. And the Protestant white Anglo-Saxon majority did not like this. And it caused a cultural war that saw the post-Civil War Republican Party and the Ku Klux Klan making common cause against Catholic schools, ended with the turn of the last century movement to uniform school systems, which were, incidentally, Protestant in all but name. The same legislatures that voted to make one kind of school deliver education actually passed bills to require Protestant prayers and so forth, which, of course, if you're atheist, Jewish, Jehovah's Witness, or anything, you knew it was selected, right? It was normative. I could talk about that history all day. My doctorate's in history. But I'm going to move on. Let's just talk about the theory of educational pluralism. So the first premise behind educational pluralism is this. Education really can't be neutral with respect to values. That it's really impossible to design a human institution that doesn't reflect some goals, even if we've forgotten the original rationale. So if you've been in a school, worked leading a school, you know that every time you set a disciplinary code, every time you have classroom protocols, every time you choose a curriculum, you're making judgments. This is not nefarious. This is how human institutions work. And pluralism simply says, because we can't have a neutral school with respect to values, we're going to fund different kinds of schools that are different from one another in meaningful ways. The second premise is the equity premise, which is that children have different needs. So we need to help all children, not just wealthy families, find the school that works for them. The best funded district school is not going to be the ideal environment for every child. And that's all right. We just have to make it possible for parents to find the best match. And by the way, that doesn't just have to do with school funding. It has to do with transportation. It has to do with equitable funding for kids with special needs and so on. All right, this is where it gets a little bit more unfamiliar. The third premise is that education belongs predominantly in civil society. And there's a reason for this. It's the premise is there's a risk in assigning entire authority to the state. There's a risk, right, of state overreach, of states actually providing normative claims for students. There's also a risk in ultimate individualism, because and this is really important, that if you leave education exclusively in the hands of the individual, you have concerns about quality and the fracturing of the democratic polity. In contrast, if the state manages, sometimes operates, but also funds schools, in the voluntary sector, you're building up this third component of a democracy. You're allowing people to navigate and creating voluntary organizations. Hong Kong, which I stubbornly keep here, before the Chinese took it over. In China, actually, the government channeled all of its education fund through Catholic schools and other kinds of nonprofits. So this is about civil society. This fourth premise is one of my favorites, which is that education, unlike other choices that we make, like which pair of jeans to buy, education affects all of us. It matters to me that your child knows how to read. It should matter to you that my children know the branches of government. It should matter that first-generation children have all the academic opportunities that well-resourced families have. And so, democracies have to ensure excellence. Now, this is where often pluralists and libertarians part ways a bit, because a libertarian view would say parent enrollment is the only thing that matters, the only quality measure. A pluralist would say, well, is it not an appropriate goal of public policy to ensure that there are no really dreadful choices? I'm basically quoting my friend and mentor Charlie Glenn there. It's an appropriate goal of public policy to ensure that there are no failing schools. How do you do that is the tricky thing. How do you do that is the tricky thing. But I do believe that we lose something when we lose that strand, that the purpose, the telos, if you will, of public funding for education is not parent autonomy, and it's not an individual good. It is, but it is also a common good. If you want to read a really good book on this, I recommend E.D. Hirsch's book, How to Educate a Citizen, because it talks about the role of a liberal arts curriculum, of strong knowledge-building content to close achievement gaps and to create a democratic conversation, democratic reference points. We can unpack that in the discussion. And finally, and this is the good news, that when school systems emphasize access to distinctive schools and a rigorous curriculum, let me just pause. American schools under-challenge students. There's ample research on this. We systematically under-challenge students. That when school systems do these two things, good things happen for kids. And the good news is that every school of every kind and every system can work to this end. Our institute at Johns Hopkins works with all different kinds of school systems, from district to Catholic to community-based schools to charters, helping with these two things, distinctive cultures. Look at Miami-Dade, where all the district schools have started to differentiate, or San Antonio, and to ensure a high bar academically. So where we are right now, we are, as you know, in a time of great polarization. And in Ohio, there's been a lot of school choice movement towards the growth of non-charter schooling, of non-district schooling, and so forth. And for those of us like me who think that options are good, this is a good thing, right? For a pluralist. However, at the same time, there's some risks. And this is how I would see it from looking at different systems around the world. There's a risk in blowing up systems and not caring about quality. The first risk is that there are voices against a public assurance of quality. Now, we can disagree about what that looks like. And I don't think that the way we do accountability in the United States is necessarily, it's not the most productive, it's not the best for kids. But there's dispute about whether it even matters. There's the parents know best. Let me say there's ample research that parents operate within social networks. And if social networks are limited, parents don't have the information they need. I'm thinking of Patrick Wolf's research on the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, and it, quote, parents need a person. If 40% of adults in our cities are functionally illiterate, they can't just say, oh, where am I going to send my child? If there's no transportation system, how are you going to get your child across town? Baltimore has this problem with its open enrollment situation. No government regulations, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then there's a movement in educational tech that is very focused on personalized learning. I am in favor of personalized learning if it rests on something solid, if it is personalized around rich content. I can see Checkers smiling at me and thinking, oh boy. Here's the other risk. A lot of times our adult population confuses exposure and indoctrination. Now, this is one of the things that strikes me the most about pluralism, is in healthy systems, all kinds of schools are funded to create a kind of organic community that families feel comfortable with. At the same time, at a certain point, kids have to learn certain stuff. And that may be stuff that the parents don't agree with, but it's seen as pedagogically important. Now, I'm not advocating that we enforce this right now, but this would be my hope. Let me give you some examples. Back to the Netherlands. The Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools. They fund creationist schools. But every child in a creationist school has to demonstrate competence of evolutionary theory at some point in their secondary school. Parents, we're not ready for this, but it is normal in those contexts. If you were in Belgium or France or Alberta, Canada, you might send your child to an Inuit school or a Jewish day school funded by the state, but you'd still have to learn what Catholics believe and what Hindus believe because it's pedagogically important. It's part of being a citizen of the world. So when you think of it that way, it flips our model, where our normal model now is, our default model, not in Ohio anymore, I understand that, but the default model is district schools, eclectic content, right? Most teachers are trained to create their own content. Even if they're great at it, the odds from a child's perspective of having a coherent, experience in education is very low. So educational pluralism is really it flips our model. It isn't just asking for an exception to the norm of uniformity. It's not just letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and it helps parents understand the difference between exposure and indoctrination. Again, we're not there, but I want to say the rejection of the liberal arts curriculum is something I'm very concerned about. This is also an historical trajectory. If Johan Neem were here, who actually registered for this event, he's a professor of history, and he's written a lot about the role that the liberal arts played in all of these diverse school models in the 19th century. You might go to a Congregationalist school or a Catholic school, but you all knew the same mathematical formulas. You all knew to memorize the Declaration of Independence, for example. There was common knowledge. You knew what the capitals were. In the early 20th century, and Diane Ravitch's book, Left Back, is the best book on this. In the early 20th century, there was a movement in education. Do we democratize the liberal arts, like most countries do, or do we teach skills and process? Over time, the skills and process side won. Now, I would love to spend more time talking about this, but the consequence of that is ever as grave as the consequence of uniformity, because the consequence is we now have generations of adults who did not experience rich content. We have teachers who don't know the documents, and that's where we need to help. We're crying out for this. When France, which is a pluralistic country, when France democratized the liberal arts and required a high bar for all their kids, they closed the achievement gaps between wealthy and poor countries by wealthy and poor children by 6th grade. I mean, this can happen. This is why the famous Catholic high school effect. Catholic high schools that James Coleman studied closed the gaps between wealthy and poor kids. Why? Lots of factors, but mostly a strong school culture and a narrow, rigorous liberal arts curriculum. I know we'll be talking about that. So, am I over time at this point?
You're right about time.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, let me just close by this. So let me just a few things about bringing this down into Ohio. These are just early thoughts. Again, I'm an historian. Things take time to change. This is not about one legislative session. This is about changing the conversation, changing the narrative. It takes time. It took 100 years to get one system. It could take 100 years to get another. But in Ohio, could include the state level incentives to using high quality curriculum. Now this right here is from the Council of Chief State School Officers. It's the membership organization for all state superintendents. Ohio is a member of their instructional materials professional development movement, one of 13 states that's trying to pull that lever at the state level. This is really good. It should be encouraged. Help districts do this work. Our team has worked with Dayton and Akron and other, it can be done. And I think if the State Department of Ed reviewed private and homeschooling curricula also, parents need to know what's there, what's not there in terms of knowledge building and quality. Louisiana, when it started its drive for high quality content, had content summits that were open to all different kinds of teachers, Catholic, charter, about why knowledge matters, how do you build it. Instructional leadership summits for all sectors. You try to create the conditions for collaboration instead of combat. And you know, in the interim, between now and a pluralistic time where our weapons are down fully, we can create kind of voluntary data dashboards for parent access and information. Longitudinal data. I know from Chad Aldis that Ohio is working on this, but if you were in Georgia, Georgia follows its young people through K-12 into the workforce. And this is really, really good because you can start to say, hey, what works? What are the outcomes? And invest in parent navigators. That's the other really important piece. Let's realize that parents aren't coming to it with full information and so forth. So I'm sorry for going long, but thank you for the time. That's my remarks are done.
You good from there?
Yes.
Okay. So I agree with just about everything you said. I got to give you grief on a few points.
I know.
One of the raps on these pluralistic countries is that the schools, all of them are really teaching the state curriculum and they're giving the state exams, and the only thing that's different is they can add religion on top. And that not much else is all that different from school to school because they're teaching the same stuff and giving the same tests.
That's actually not quite accurate. Most of these countries, there are changes from year to year, but let me give you a great example of this. In England, the English ministry studied, they funded a third party to study the largest sectors, which were Anglican and elementary and Catholic, and to study leadership. And what do the leaders believe they're doing in the schools? And they found out that Catholic leaders had a very, very clear sense of what their schools were about, the mission and so forth. The Anglicans, not so much. And so the Anglican community said, we've got to revive our schools and make them different. I guess what I'm saying is, in a pluralistic system, it is conceivable that schools could have a turn towards one thing, but the content doesn't drive that. It's the school community, it's the ethos, and that is the responsibility of the school community, to hold itself and its narratives. For example, what if we had a school that was founded on critical race theory? And they, taught different, and they exposed kids to different theories, but that was their formation. Parents could send their kids there. They could send their children to a Montessori school and so forth.
So you're saying the pluralistic schools don't have to teach the state curriculum?
They have to teach to the state curriculum. They do, but that does not diminish the distinctiveness of the school community. So for example, in Alberta, Canada, the citizenship and history curriculum looks different in a Catholic school than it does in the state school. There are different vocabulary talking about the same thing. The philosophy looks very different. So if I'm in an Islamic school and I'm teaching about Hinduism, I can teach what Hinduism teaches and say, as a Muslim, I reject this. There's a filter that is brought to that. And there's also, I just want to be clear that I'm not talking about a textbook lockstep curriculum.
Okay.
That's a really important distinction.
Okay.
So if you're talking about accountability on academics, I would say the most effective means is an exit exam that is content specific. England does this. My little girls were in schools in England and when I was in graduate school, and every few years there's a benchmark assessment that all the kids across the country take, but the teachers design their own curricula in response to those content standards. So it's much more like an IB program, for example, that says here's a list of texts to choose from, or here are the philosophies that kids should learn about in this grade. How you inculcate that is distinctive, if that makes sense. So I'm not talking about a common textbook.
So it's more like the standards are in common and the choice of curriculum materials is up to the school.
The standards are in common and the choice, it depends. Let me just make a few qualifications. Standards by standards in those contexts, it is not just skills-based, it is content-based. So let me give you the difference. If you're in a skills-based school system and you look at the Declaration of Human Rights as a document, the teachers are going to say, what does this word mean? What does this word mean? Provide evidence of what these two ideas are connected. A liberal arts approach that is content-rich is going to say, when was this written? Why was it stunning? Why did we have to have a document about human rights? What just happened? Who was against human rights? Why was this an important stake in the ground? And those kinds of richer, deeper questions. So, and one more thing, in some countries there is, so the Netherlands has, any textbook has to be reviewed by the Ministry of Education. They're talking about equivalent but not equal. So you teach the same information through a different lens. The ministry stamps almost everything except for anti-Western textbooks that are anti-democratic. They won't allow it. So there's a limit. There's always a limit to what is tolerated, and that's...
Okay, so let's go to the accountability question, which for me personally is the stickiest wicket here, which is how do you assure that the kids coming out of diverse schools have acquired equivalent and comparable educations. If you don't do a standardized achievement test across all schools from the state at the end of every school year, sort of like we do under No Child Left Behind and ESSA.
So I agree with having some menu of plausible exams. I think none of the exams, the state exams, tend to be very skills focused. If you want to think about a good model in our country, look at Louisiana, where they have actually used the federal pilot authority to create curriculum aligned 4 stakes assessments that, so if your teacher in English is using the wit and wisdom curriculum, which is quite strong, children will take a 4 stakes assessment on wit and wisdom. There are ways, it's the more targeted towards academic content mastery, whether it's competency-based, if there's content to be mastered. And I cannot emphasize how important that actual knowledge building is. Competency-based exams every few years that can be achieved in different measures, different ways, different pedagogies, I think that would be the sweet spot at the end of the day. Right now, nationally normed reference tests are fine because that's what we've got.
Aren't you making it harder by adding content? That is to say, aren't you making it less likely that schools will want to participate in something because they can agree on skills but not necessarily on content? Somebody wants Benjamin Franklin and somebody else wants Sojourner Truth.
Right. So the best way to do that is to actually, in the setting of the standards of the academic content, knowledge building standards, to not have specific authors, to say, you need to have your children reading from the early Republic. Kids need to demonstrate competence of the Federalist Papers. You can choose which ones you're going to read. It should not be lockstep. And there should be room for local kind of maneuverability. So here's a really good example. The Educating for American Democracy project is a roadmap for civics and social studies. It's a framework that asks the deep questions of democracy and is insistent on learning content. But they're piloting in 3 different districts with different demographies. And so one of the curricula that they're piloting has the same framework, the same goals, the same content framework, but one is using more Latino-focused documents because of its population and so on. There's flexibility. There should always be that. In Alberta, Canada, the Inuit schools teach literature, but they also they can put more of their own traditions in the literature that is studied, and the kids can write about that on their exams. So the way we structured, because I worked on the Louisiana, my colleague David Steiner and I have worked on the Louisiana exams. It's not, the way the assessments work is, it's not tell me about The Stranger novel. It's more, based on what you've read in the last year, how would you answer the question of X? It's causing kids to think. And so one can imagine designing a state assessment that asks those kinds of questions. It's almost like an AP Latin class. Well, that's a little bit obscure, but I guess, there's a role for universities in this as well.
So let me ask about a different kind of flexibility. Does your model allow for, let's say, CTE schools and classical academies and discovery learning schools and outdoor education schools and things that are really quite different in how they're organized and what they have kids do and things like that?
It depends. I mean, there's one form of school that is not funded in the Netherlands, and that's the Waldorf school, because they don't believe in assessments like the rest of they have portfolio assessments, so they're not funded. I would say there is ample room in a pluralist system for different pedagogies, different approaches, whether it's classical and Socratic or kind of project-based learning, as long as the content is learned, as long as the kind of buckets of learning are being mastered. CTE is done particularly well in many of these countries because their high bar intellectually that every kid has to master by the time they're in 8th grade means you're not saying, oh, these low-scoring kids go off into CTE. You're actually saying everyone has this basic knowledge. What do you want to study? What do you want to do? And they actually start branching off. Germany, Switzerland, and most of those countries, 60% of the kids go to meaningful, CTE programs. I'm very much in favor of that, but not if it sits on top of an undereducated population.
Okay, one more from me, and then let's open this up to others in the room. You mentioned Miami-Dade as a place that's diversifying its public school system, and I'm thinking of DC, where half the kids go to charter schools, and there's also a voucher program. I'm thinking of places that have what they call portfolio
Yes.
districts, where the district operates multiple kinds of schools, including charters and neighborhood schools and others. Isn't America, New Orleans, everybody goes to a charter school, or what used to be a charter school until recently. Isn't America doing this in a handful of places?
I think there are places like DC where younger families coming along truly don't know the battles that got the charter schools in place, right? And now there's younger families don't even know necessarily if they're enrolling their child in a district or a charter. And so that, I would say, is very healthy. There are small places that have kind of where the momentum is so great. But here's what I would continue to point to. As long as we are pitting sectors against each other, as long as we are weaponizing our research, as long as we have to show legitimacy on either side, then we're not in that generous place that I would call pluralism. And I'll just close with this. When I first started researching this, I talked to a counterpart in the UK and said, do you guys talk about the Catholic school effect here? And he said, what is that? And I said, well, we talk a lot. Tony Brike's work is how do you translate what Catholic schools did into district schools and so forth. And he said, we do not study districts. If you district versus charter versus, we don't pit schools against each other. The Netherlands actually forbade kind of sector analysis for a long time because the value was the distinctiveness and the academic outcome. Now, I do think there's a civil rights reason to look at outcomes always, but the point is we will not be in an educationally plural system until everyone has been able to put down their weapons. There's still arguments. There's still going to be arguments. Education's too important to say there won't be arguments, but it's not about superiority.
The researcher in me still wants to know whether type A school teaches better than type B school.
Well, if you were in England, it would be on an individual basis. So if you look at what Ofsted, their kind of third-party inspector, looks at in a given locale, they have all the schools listed. They're different kinds of schools, and parents can see what the outcomes are, what the missions are, and so forth. But they're not compared to each other. It's all, you're getting better, you need intervention, that kind of thing. So it's a different world. It's actually more outcome oriented. In Northern Europe, most most of the provinces, small towns and ministries of education have ample information on what the outcomes are. What do the kids do when they graduate? When I look at Baltimore City, and we just read yesterday, 13 high schools in Baltimore City have not one child who is proficient in math. That is a tragedy for all of us. So there's a lot of work that can be done. And I guess my hope, the pluralist dream, is that on the far side of this, we're really educating children in content that matters, allowing a civil tolerance. I will say one more thing, I'm sorry, I can't get off of this. Civil tolerance matters, and the best way to champion the capacity to hear diverse views and argue with respect is practice in the classroom. Most democracies have something called the International Civics and Citizenship Education Survey. The United States has not participated since 1999, but it has a panel of validated questions. Do your teachers present multiple viewpoints in class? Do students feel comfortable speaking their views if they are in the minority? This is the difference between exposure and indoctrination. And my institute does have a school culture survey that brings those measures in, because 40 years of data show classroom practice with deliberation leads to political efficacy as an adult.
Floor is open for anyone. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good morning. Katie from the Department of Education. I'd love to hear more from you, more of your thoughts on the ways in which civics and even like ethics can be incorporated in public schools. I was just listening to Fernando Reimers from Harvard, whose work you might be familiar with. And could you expand on the benefits and also maybe some of the practical implications of putting ethics and civics into the mainstream education system, K-12?
Sure, absolutely. So when political scientists look at successful civic formation in democracy, they're usually looking at 4 indicators. Political knowledge, and by this, it's not just do you know the branches of government, but do you know the difference between a monarchy and a democracy? Do you know how monarchies were justified and it robust? So it's political knowledge, political skills. Do you know how to write well? Could you write your congressperson, right? Could you interpret a graph, data, those kinds of skills. Number 3 is the habit of civic involvement. So that for this reason, many schools have requirements of community service. And the 4th is this civil tolerance. And we know that schools can make a difference here. So there's a lot of research about, again, do you have the conditions for deliberation and debate in the classroom? This is something that principals and system leaders can take charge of. I have worked with great examples of schools that say, democracy requires exposure to different views and dealing with them in a rational, intelligent way. We're going to do that. So parents know if they walk in the door, your kids are going to be exposed to different things. I do think a good curriculum, to answer your question more pointedly, a good curriculum can do a lot of this work. If you have a great social studies curriculum and you help teachers make the time to teach it and you give them professional training, then ethics, religion, philosophy should be built in. For this reason, I'm really in favor of having strong social studies materials K to 12. K to 12.
It's going to require more than 20 minutes a day in 5th grade.
But we know from the Fordham Institute's research that when kids spend more time on social studies, their reading scores go up. So, I mean, there are all kinds of benefits. I do think it works. I do think you have to have the conditions. You have to have ample professional development. Remember, for 100 years, we've had process and skills over content. Teachers need content support. They need it. They need their leaders to say, this matters. And you're not going to get in trouble if you introduce ideas to the classroom. But
Okay.
also, sorry.
You had a question?
Yes. Nathaniel Grossen from the Center of Education Reform and the Yass Prize. So the microschooling question. Ever since the pandemic, there's been this explosion of microschooling, and in some states it's aided by a pretty robust ESA program. And from your view, do you see these microschool environments working in this system of education pluralism, and are ESAs an effective tool to produce education pluralism?
good questions. ESAs could be, but I think the extent to which ESAs are incentivizing high quality options is the extent to which an ESA is effective in pluralism. I have real concerns of the kind of no holds barred, parents can buy whatever they want. I think that gets back to the purpose of taxpayer funded education, which is academic competence, social mobility, civic formation, all those things. So I'm more skeptical of ESAs. I'm not skeptical of micro schools per se. I think that's a variety on the same theme. Parents should be able to homeschool. Parents should be able to do micro schools. I do think there's a role for transparency. What content are they using? You know, I think that would be if a state can provide a dashboard of, we've had these reviewed, these are really strong curricula, and even before there's any kind of, you know, control or coercion, just show parents what they're getting. Most parents don't know. I mean, curricula is hard work.
Okay, who else? Yes, ma'am.
Colleen Haronchak from the Cato Institute, kind of along the lines of the micro school. So are your concerns with the pluralism and the standards and all that strictly if it's taxpayer funded? Like, or do you, like, so are you okay with all that as long as taxpayer money's not going to?
Well, it is a very interesting question. So if you just, is it, if somebody wants to do their own thing and not be funded, do we care? I think the Supreme Court, in the same cases that are very school choice, like Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the court and our laws are very clear that the state does have an interest in all kids' education. And so what does that look like? So, you know, I would say that there is a state, a democratic interest in making sure that kids know how to read, the kids' basic competency. Of course, I would love for it to be even bigger than that with liberal arts, but I don't think the state, I do not think the state can or should relinquish that fundamental purpose, that we're taxing people, even if taxpayer money is not involved. And there have been plenty of cases on this.
Because some ESAs are structured in complicated ways so that money never enters the state, so it's not technically state money.
Well, that tax credit's the same thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It's not state, tax credits are never considered state coffers, but the same principles, there is still a state interest. So this comes up sometimes in sort of inflammatory cases around homeschooling curricula and so forth. And what does the, you know, Nazi curricula, for example? I mean, these are outliers. These are not the norm. But what do you do? What kind of mechanisms do you have in place?
I usually talk about this as there's a private interest in education and there's a public interest in education. The private interest is all the good that it does a kid and the family.
Yes.
And the public interest is the next generation is able to invent new things because they're all well educated.
That's right. Amen. That's well put. I mean, when you look at our founding documents, what all the founders believed, what every single Supreme Court case and our laws themselves talk about, there's a purpose, there's a telos for it, and we forget that.
Who else? Yes.
I have a quick one here. So working with these.
Who are you?
Tyler Shinneberry with Epic. We're a business, technology, and community partner with these schools. So working with youth, probably in the 9 years old and up, and connecting them to find a passion and a purpose. So one of the things that we've discovered is that these students find no relationship between, when you talk about the content and skill, they find no relationship between what they are learning in the school to the opportunities that are available out to them. So we try and present that to them. How does this work across all these different types of schools? It's hard enough to get this in with the public schools. How can we do more as businesses to work with them regardless of what type of school it is?
Well, that's a really good question. And, you know, I think some of this is in the U.S. Chambers of Commerce's can do a lot. I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce now has civics, National Civics Bee. We're working with them on this. There are things that businesses can do. I still think, I mean, if one thing businesses could do is fund excellent professional development that is content specific. So, you know, if you want to bring in the Bill of Rights Institute or, you know, another really great professional development, the curriculum providers often have excellent knowledge building instructional designs. If businesses could underwrite that junior achievement, some of these other things. But I think I want to mention what you indicated at first about the disinterest in schooling. And I've been in many classrooms where children were bored out of their minds. And if they get, this cannot be, this is not good. In being able to give educators the incentives to learn the content and to have conversations in class that are engaging, that's a long-term proposition, but it's really, that's the long-term bet. So the Ohio, the departments of education that are actually creating educator summits around high-quality instruction, you have to be really single-minded, because if you want to focus on the school culture and the instructional core, you can't let all the other stuff that goes on in schools, the latest bells and whistles, interfere. You've got to focus on those things.
We have time for one or two more. Yeah, go ahead. I was hoping somebody from the Buckeye Institute would pipe up.
Well, thank you for the excellent presentation. Going back to the beginning where you identified sort of the two buckets, how countries deal with it, the pluralist sort of school versus the uniformity. Do you have examples of a nation that has shifted from uniform to pluralism, and what lessons, as we're attempting to expand school choice here in Ohio, what lessons could we learn?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the Netherlands, which is they actually have educational freedom built into their constitution. They moved from a unitary to a pluralistic system. And it was actually, it took a long time, but what they learned was, first of all, the southern provinces of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, when they had a unitary system, the southern provinces broke off and formed the nation of Belgium in 1840. So that was pretty much that was a wake-up call, right? We can't enforce.
Southern Ohio can secede.
No, I'm not advocating. I am not advocating for that. I'm just saying that what they learned was that negotiating a way for parents to feel comfortable and for democratic formation to occur, it's worth it. It's worth those compromises. And it took a long, long time. Another example that I like is Alberta, Canada, which had, it always had some parallel Catholic system and Protestant state systems. But in the 1970s and 80s, their school system performance was miserable, really, really bad. And so they did three things, what I would call a grand bargain. They centralized the tax funding so that it was not, funding for schools was not contingent on property values. Number one, they equalized funding. Number two, they put in place a liberal arts curriculum with assessments. I mean, their system was so bad, the kids only had to have one history class to graduate high school, and the whole model was like psychology, like why was Hitler who he was, instead of asking what happened, Versailles Treaty and all that. Okay, so the first was equalizing funding, second was a high quality curriculum, third they expanded the options. That's when they started creating Inuit schools and Jewish day schools and so forth. So I would say Alberta is a really good model of a school system that evolved. Many of the countries in South America and Africa are working very hard on public-private partnerships to deliver education, and there's a whole network of these schools, and UNESCO is working with them as well. It's by far this changing model is, school systems go in both ways.
Alberta is interesting because the Canadian province is more like a U.S. state than anything else we've been talking about is.
And Australia is another example. The Australian federal government, as I said, is now the top funder of private school tuitions. It's based on the student's socioeconomic status and so forth. It's a provincial school system, but the federal government does this because they've seen the research and the impact on low-income kids. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to, I know that was supposed to be the last question, but this actually really raises an interesting question. You mentioned that one of the things that helped Alberta be able to accomplish this was the centralization of funding. So as I look back over the multiple countries, obviously pluralism requires equitable funding. How do you get equitable funding, especially in a system that's very fractious? You obviously know how you have state and you have local. And now the state spends more in aggregate than the locals, but it's highly disparate across the different districts. Is there any successful examples of a pluralist system that doesn't have a centralized taxing mechanism or centralized funding mechanism for whatever?
I mean, Germany forbids national education. I mean, they have, for their own historical reasons. Germany is very localized by the problem, you know,
State system also, actually. It's like a state system.
Yes, that's exactly right. And, you know, I know Indiana's here has tried to equalize its tax structures and funding, and it's very difficult to do that. You know, we have a huge group of American adults who buy their way into the school district that they want, and you know, there's something inequitable about that. When you look at, most countries don't do it that way.
So I don't think we're giving him a great answer to whether it's possible to have a pluralistic system without a unified funding.
Yeah, the fundings are different. I think it's possible. It certainly is possible. It's done, you know. But it would be a challenge. It would be a challenge here.
So we are out of time. I think Ashley and I are going to linger for a few minutes if people have more questions to come up, but I believe we are concluded. Gentlemen, thank you for hosting us, and thank you all for coming, and hope that there are many more of these.